Hello, welcome to EC 418 session 4 of lab course. In the next few lectures, we're going to make a device called a MOSFET, which is basically an NMOS transistor. So far you've learned techniques such as thermal evaporation, sputtering, spin coating, and the likes to get a feeling for how you can go about fabricating structures in a clean room environment. Now we're going to use these techniques in a deposition / oxidation, photo and etch loop to make the device that we call MOSFET for the next few classes. Traditionally in the industry, this kind of loop is carried on for each mask step, and the number of mask steps could be as high as even 150. So it will be a good introduction to see how a traditional depth photo etch loop looks like and what kind of inline parameters you can keep track of when actually doing these steps. So silicon wafer, which is P-type 111, and we'll do some basic measurements before we go ahead and fabricate the MOSFET. Okay, so the first step, as usual, is to measure the resistivity of our wafer and see what the doping actually looks like using a 4-point probe. This is to make sure that the actual wafer resistivity is close to what it says on the wafer itself. It looks like we see a voltage drop of around 4.32 millivolts for 100 microamp current that's applied. So you can extract the resistivity of our wafer from this measurement. The next step is, as with the beginning of any process step, is to perform an AID clean, that is using acetone, IPA, and DI water. Okay, now that we have cleaned our wafers using AID clean, we can go ahead and deposit or grow something called pad oxide or wet oxide. So pad oxide is usually used to electrically isolate devices. It is a thick oxide, and growing a thick oxide of around 400 to 500 nanometers requires a higher growth rate oxidation process, which is usually wet oxidation. So in this section, we're going to use wet oxidation, which is basically flowing in a mixture of O2 and water vapor. So the oxide growth rate is much faster compared to a dry oxide. The only drawback is it doesn't have the film is not as high quality as the dry oxidation, so we may not be able to use the wet oxide for making a gate dielectric. But it is good enough to isolate devices, so we can use it as a pad oxide based on which we can build our devices. So as you can see, we're using a similar recipe to grow the wet oxide. We're using tube C to avoid cross-contamination, and as you can see, the tube C is at 1100 centigrade, the temperature at which we can grow wet oxide quick enough. Note that even to grow a oxide of around 500 nanometers, we still need to use around 50 minutes of growth time at this temperature. So growing thick oxide takes time. Once we have ramped the tube to this temperature, we can go ahead and load our samples into the quartz tube. So we'll be using a quartz tube that is designated only for furnace A, and we'll use a similar loading technique where we will be using dummy wafers, which is on either end of the silicon wafer, and we'll be loading in 3 wafers just to make sure that we can grow the big devices with all 3 wafers. Some of these wafers are as test wafers for later on in the process. Once we load our wafers in, we're going to make sure that the flows are at the place where they are supposed to be. So we'll be using the flow meters, MFCs for the wet oxidation tube in this case, and we'll be using high flow oxygen at flow rate of 30, which works out to be 30 liters per minute in our case. And the oxide is delivered using a bubbler system, as you can see over here. The bubbler is at around 100 C, temperature enough to create vapor pressure to pulse in oxygen along with the water vapor. So this is to make sure that we are actually growing oxide at a faster rate. It is important to make sure that the temperature stays close to 100 C or above 100 C, so that there is enough of a water vapor pressure, or else the growth rate of the ultimate oxide is not going to be uniform. The actual way to grow an wet oxide in the industry is usually using hydrogen and oxygen as pure gases and burning them right before they are introduced into the chamber. This is so that the water that is produced is ultra pure. But for the research purposes and for the purpose of this course, we can get away with using both. So we'll go ahead and load our wafers now. The wafer board, as you can see, needs to be halfway inside, so gently push it so that the wafers don't crack with huge thermal gradients across them. Once they are sufficiently in, slowly draw it out and start the timer. Now that it's been 50 minutes, we can pull out our wafers slowly. It is important to keep an exact track of the time, just to make sure that you're growing the oxide that you're actually thinking of growing. Another thing to keep in mind is to make sure that you don't pull out the wafers again too fast, or else you can end up cracking your wafers due to thermal gradients. So make sure to pull out your wafers slowly and gently along with the quartz board, onto your glass substrate. Then you can go ahead and go to the next processing steps. Again, a quick sanity check to see if we have actually grown oxide. We can place a wafer against a reference silicon wafer to see if there's a change in color. It's kind of hard to tell based on the color what the exact oxide thickness is, because the oxide is thicker than 400 nanometers. So the colors kind of repeat themselves, but it gives us evidence at least that the oxide has grown. You can also see that there are shades of different colors right near the edges, and this can indicate potential non-uniformity in the film that you do. But we can go ahead and quickly do a uniformity measurement to see how the thickness and the uniformity looks like on the ellipsometer. Okay, as you can see, we've done ellipsometry scans of 3 wafers that we loaded in for wet oxidation. It is always good to keep track of the inline thickness data while you're doing your experiments, so you can kind of get a feel for how the process looks like. You can see that the front wafer, the oxide is thicker, it's around 515 nanometers. The middle wafer is slightly thinner compared to the front one, and the back is even thinner than that. It's important to make sure that you have a minimum thickness of around 450 nanometers for the pad oxide, so that it acts as an effective diffusion barrier later on when we do spin-on coating and spin-on P-glass and diffuse phosphorus through the rest of the wafer. Where the pad oxide acts as a barrier in places where we don't want to dope the wafer. So we've been able to achieve above 450 nanometers, but there is a slight variation in the thickness that you see. This could be due to the flow. As you can see that it is slightly thicker on one end and gets slightly thinner towards the edges. So you can see that there's definitely slightly higher flow here compared to the rest of the wafer. You can also see that the thicker oxide in the front of the wafer as opposed to the back side as the third wafer is probably due to not enough water vapor reaching the back side of the wafer, which could result in a slightly lower growth rate over the time that we measure. Okay, now that we have grown wet oxide or pad oxide on our wafer, the next step is to actually pattern this oxide to make our MOSFET devices. The way we go about doing this is to use photolithography, which is essentially spin coating a photoresist and patterning it by exposing it selectively using a nickel chrome mask and UV radiation, and then removing the photoresist in those selected places. Once we transfer the pattern onto the photoresist, it is important to do a pattern transfer from the photoresist onto the pad oxide using the pattern that we want. And this is done using buffered oxide etch, like we saw before. So we use the same process of spin coating, except that there is an extra step after UV exposure where we develop our photoresist and do a hard bake prior to it. So let's go on and spin coat our photoresist. Now that we have spin coated our wafer with the photoresist, we can go ahead and do something called soft bake, which will remove the volatile compounds in the photoresist and make it tacky enough for the subsequent patterning step using photolithography. Okay, now we can pattern our photoresist using this mask aligner over here from Karlsruhe. So this tool over here can be used to align our mask with respect to our substrate. Since the first mask that we will be using is a registration mask, we don't need to use any alignment per se, but we need to make sure that the entire pattern lies within the substrate, and the substrate is at the right Z height, so for the UV radiation to focus and expose the photoresist in certain places where it is supposed to be exposed. For the mask aligner to work, there are some essential utilities. The main thing is to make sure that the nitrogen is on, so it keeps the lamp cool. The UV lamp is a mercury arc lamp and is a broadline lamp with a lot of radiation peaks lying in the UV range, ranging from 193 nanometers to around 360 nanometers. So the photoresist we use has to be compatible with a broadline UV lamp. Once we make sure that the nitrogen is on, we got to make sure that the compressor is on as well. This actuates the shutters on the Karlsruhe aligner so that we can expose for a certain amount of time based on the power intensity of the UV lamp that we measured before, and that's around 2.5 seconds for a 350 watt lamp. There's also a power supply for the lamp that needs to be checked before switching on the lamp, so you don't actually end up not getting the kind of power density that you want to make sure that the photoresist is exposed. Once we switch on the lamp, we need to make sure that the settings on the aligner are in the correct spot. We will be using a soft contact mode for the rest of our experiments using the aligner in this class. The soft contact is where the contact between the substrate and the lamp is just made using a mechanical force, as opposed to a hard contact mode where you have nitrogen pushing against the substrate and creating a firmer contact between the substrate and the mask. This creates better resolution and pattern density, but it is not necessary for the feature sizes that we are using. Just to show you how a micro mask looks like. This is an example of a nickel chromium mask. These masks can be fabricated using a DWL instrument over there by essentially patterning this pattern that we want to make using a photoresist on top of a quartz / nickel chromium metal coating, and exposing this pattern using a laser beam that rasterizes following this pattern. And once we etch the nickel chrome layer, we get this permanent mask that is very durable and lasts for close to a decade if properly used. We need to make sure that the chromium side of the mask faces up when we actually load in our mask. So let's do that first. And it is always important to make sure that the silicon wafer is not loaded in without having a layer of photoresist on top. This is to protect the mask and the silicon wafer in itself. Over here, or a glimpse of the pattern that we will be transferring onto a photoresist. These windows over here are the diffusion edge windows for the MOS transistor, where we will be diffusing an N-type phosphorus xenon dopant later on in the next step, prior to which we need to etch the pad oxide that we do down to the silicon. The other windows that you see over here that have interesting shapes are basically test structures that you can use later on to characterize certain aspects of the wafer. For example, this over here is a resistor that is basically that can be fabricated using the phosphorus that is diffused through the silicon. And this big window over here is for the transfer link measurement structures, measure contact. The E's that you see over here are essentially alignment marks, and these will be important later on in the next mask step, where we will be using these E's as references to align our pattern from mask 2 to the pattern transferred mask 1 onto a silicon wafer. Okay, now that we have loaded our wafer into the mask aligner, we need to make sure that it is at the optimum Z height before exposing the pattern to the photoresist. If the Z height is not adjusted properly, you can get fuzzy feature resolution, and this can translate onto your subsequent masks, which will essentially result in devices that don't end up working. So it is very important to make sure that your Z height is at the optimum range. The way we do this is to make sure it is at a position called contact. This is essentially a position where your substrate that's coated with the photoresist is actually in contact with the mask. And the way you can verify this is to keep the mask loose and move your X and Y knobs so that you can see the mask move along with your substrate. This is only possible when your substrate and your mask are touching with each other, that is, they are in contact. There is another mode called separation, which essentially separates the substrate from the mask by a few tens of microns. This is useful later on when we are doing alignment. So we have a reference pattern under the substrate we can see that is separated from the mask, and we can align our substrate accordingly before bringing them to contact and exposing the photoresist. So to make sure it is actually in separation, when it is in separation, you need to adjust your Z height so that the mask doesn't move when your substrate is moved during separation. Verify this again when it is in contact. Your mask moves along with your substrate, but when it is in separation, it does not move. When that happens, you are at the optimum Z height to go ahead and do your exposure. Now before doing our exposure, we need to make sure we lock the mask back into place and bring it to contact, and then press exposure over here, which brings the optics forward and exposes the mask for the step time, that is 2.5 seconds. Now we can go ahead and press exposure to expose our photoresist. Exposure. Now that we have exposed our photoresist onto our wafer, the pattern, parts of the wafer that are coated with the photoresist and are exposed to the UV radiation actually break chemical bonds using the UV assisted photoreaction. But to make sure that we remove the photoresist in these regions, we use a developing solution to remove the exposed regions of the photoresist. Prior to that, we do something called a post-exposure soft bake for 3 minutes, again at 85 C, to make sure that the reaction is complete and doesn't encroach over features that have not been exposed to UV radiation. So let's go ahead and develop our film. Let's go ahead and develop our wafer that we patterned. The developer we are using here is a metal-free ion developer, which is essentially a base. Normal developers are made usually using sodium hydroxide or aluminum hydroxide, which contain metal ions. But metal ions may create defect states in your silicon and may not give good electrical devices. So we can use metal-free developers such as ammonium hydroxide. The rate of developing depends on the temperature of the solution. As you can see, we're not heating the solution right now, so it's kind of developing at a slow pace. But you can see that the photoresist is evolving from places where the photoresist is actually exposed to the UV light, and we need to develop this for around 2 minutes to make sure we get our pattern that we see. We can rinse off the developer using DI water onto our wafer. As you can see, there's a faint square pattern that we transferred using the photoresist on the silicon wafer over here. But it's always good to take a look under the optical microscope to check how the pattern is transferred after developing. Okay, now that our film has been developed, it's a good idea to check how the developer actually removed the photoresist and resulted in the pattern. You can see that there are areas with really good feature definition like this. So, yeah, and a good way to check how your developing recipe has worked out is to see how square the squares are. It looks like our corners are pretty good, have very good definition. There are areas where the photoresist is slightly underdeveloped, and this is probably because, for example, like this, as you can see, there are still spots of photoresist left, and this is probably because of a slightly uneven distribution of the lamp's fluence over a larger area, but this is probably okay for our recipes when we are making our transistor for this class.